I want to tell you about the kind of story that doesn't usually make headlines, because technically, nothing catastrophic actually happened in the end. Nobody went out of business. No massive fine got handed down. No CEO resigned in disgrace on live television. And that's exactly why I think this particular kind of story matters more than the ones that do make headlines. Because it's a story about how close a completely normal, reasonably well-run company came to falling apart over a decision that felt, at the time, like the most boring, unremarkable choice imaginable. Let's set the scene. A mid-sized SaaS company, the kind that exists in the background of 100 other businesses' daily operations, quietly powering something unglamorous but essential. Not the kind of company that makes headlines for flashy product launches. The kind that just works, month after month, doing its job well enough that nobody thinks about it. Which, in this industry, is honestly the highest compliment a product can receive. Like basically every company of its size, this company relies on a whole ecosystem of third-party tools to actually function. Nobody builds everything from scratch anymore. And honestly, nobody should. There's a payment processor handling transactions. There's a customer support platform managing tickets. There's an analytics tool tracking user behavior. There's a scheduling integration, an email service, a document storage system, a project management tool, and somewhere in that long list, almost indistinguishable from all the others in terms of how much attention it got during setup, there's a workflow automation tool. The kind of thing that quietly connects different parts of the business together, moving data from one system to another so employees don't have to do it manually. Nobody remembers exactly who chose this particular workflow tool. It wasn't some major strategic decision made in a boardroom. It was probably an engineer maybe 2 years earlier, trying to solve an annoying, repetitive problem, who found a tool that did the job well, had decent reviews, wasn't too expensive, and got quietly approved without much fanfare. This is how the vast majority of third-party tools actually enter a company's ecosystem. Not through some rigorous centralized vetting process, but through 100 small, reasonable, individually harmless decisions made by different people at different times, each one solving a real problem in front of them, none of them thinking of themselves as making a security decision, even though that's exactly what they were doing. This particular workflow tool had access to a genuinely uncomfortable amount of the company's internal systems, once you actually mapped it out, which nobody had really done in a while. It could read customer data. It could write to certain databases. It had API keys connecting it to at least 4 other major systems the company relied on. On its own, none of that access seemed unreasonable, because each individual permission had been granted for a specific, legitimate reason at some point. But nobody had ever stepped back and looked at the full picture of what all of those permissions added up to, together, in one place. Here's where the actual story begins. The company providing this workflow tool, a company that our SaaS business had never even really thought about, that existed as nothing more than a name on an invoice and a login page nobody logged into more than once a month, experienced a breach of its own. Somewhere on the other side of the world, an attacker found a weakness in that vendor's own infrastructure and got in. I want to pause here for a second, because I think this is the exact moment where most people's mental model of security starts to break down, and it's worth actually sitting with why. When we think about protecting our own business, we naturally think about our own walls, our own doors, our own employees, our own systems. We don't naturally think about the walls belonging to some vendor 3 steps removed from our daily operations, a company we've never met anyone from, a company whose own internal security practices we have essentially zero visibility into. But that's exactly the point where this story pivots from being someone else's problem to becoming our SaaS company's problem. Because once the attacker was inside that vendor's systems, they didn't need to find a way into our company directly. They already had it, sitting right there, in the form of every single customer who had connected that workflow tool to their own systems using API keys and access tokens that the vendor itself was now storing in a compromised environment. This is the part that I think genuinely deserves more attention than it gets. A breach at a vendor isn't just a breach affecting that one vendor. It's potentially a breach affecting every single customer of that vendor simultaneously, all at once, through no fault of their own, based entirely on a decision made by someone at a completely different company that most of those customers had never given a second thought to since the day they signed up. The attacker, once inside the vendor's systems, started quietly harvesting those stored API keys and access tokens. Not for one company, for all of them. Every business connected to that particular workflow tool suddenly had a live, valid set of credentials floating around in the hands of someone with clearly malicious intent, and every single one of those businesses had absolutely no idea this had happened, because from their own perspective, nothing had changed. They hadn't been breached directly. Their own systems hadn't been touched. The compromise happened entirely somewhere else, in an environment they never had access to and couldn't have monitored even if they'd wanted to. For our SaaS company, this meant someone now had a working key that could reach directly into their customer database, their internal messaging systems, and at least one system connected to billing information, all without ever needing to trick an employee, guess a password, or find a single vulnerability in anything our company itself had built. I think this is genuinely one of the most unsettling realities of the modern SaaS landscape, and it's worth just sitting with the weight of it for a second. You can do everything right on your own end: strong internal security culture, careful employee training, well-built systems, regular audits, all of it. And none of that matters if a tool you trusted, a tool that seemed completely unremarkable, gets compromised somewhere else, handing an attacker a direct line into your business that bypasses every single one of your own careful precautions entirely. Now here's where this particular story takes a turn that a lot of similar stories don't get to take, which is why I think it's actually worth telling in detail, rather than just being another headline about a company that got fully breached and had to send out an apology email to millions of people. A junior engineer at our SaaS company, someone who genuinely wasn't even part of the official security team, happened to notice something strange. Not through some sophisticated monitoring system catching a known attack pattern, through something much simpler and much more human. They were debugging an unrelated issue, poking around in some API logs for a completely different reason, and noticed a pattern of requests coming from an IP address that didn't match any of the usual patterns they were used to seeing from that particular integration. It could have been nothing. Genuinely, in the moment, it looked like it could have been nothing. IP addresses shift. Cloud infrastructure changes. There were a dozen boring, harmless explanations that could have accounted for what they were seeing. And I think this is honestly one of the most important parts of the entire story, because it highlights something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. The difference between a company that catches something in time and a company that doesn't often isn't about having more sophisticated tools. It's about having a culture where someone feels empowered to flag something that looks slightly off, even when they're not entirely sure it matters, even when it's not technically their job, even when there's a real chance they're about to waste everyone's time over nothing. This engineer flagged it anyway, sent a message in an internal channel, something low-key, something like, "Hey, this looks a little weird, probably nothing, but wanted to mention it." And crucially, someone actually saw that message quickly and took it seriously instead of letting it sit unread for a day, which, based on how a lot of these stories usually go, is often exactly where things go wrong. Within a few hours, a small internal team started digging into it properly, and what they found was the beginning of exactly the kind of story I described earlier: unusual access patterns tied to the workflow automation tool's API key, requests that didn't match any legitimate internal process, signs that someone somewhere was quietly testing what that access key could actually reach. Here's the part that genuinely could have gone very differently. They caught this within hours of the unusual activity actually starting, not days, not weeks. Compare that to the pattern we've talked about before, where companies routinely go a month or more without noticing anything wrong at all. This company got incredibly lucky, in the sense that the right person happened to be looking at the right logs for a completely unrelated reason, at almost exactly the right moment. But they also got something less lucky dependent, which is that when that person did notice something, the culture around them supported taking it seriously immediately instead of dismissing it. Once the security team confirmed something was genuinely wrong, everything moved fast. They immediately revoked the compromised API key, cutting off that particular access point entirely. They rotated every other credential connected to that same third-party tool, just in case. They pulled in outside help to do a deeper forensic review, trying to understand exactly what had been accessed during the window the key was compromised, and just as importantly, what hadn't been. And this is where the story genuinely could have gone one of two very different directions. And I think it's worth acknowledging honestly that a huge amount of what determined the outcome came down to timing that was, frankly, somewhat outside the company's control. Based on the forensic review, it appeared the attacker had gained access to the key and had begun some exploratory activity, essentially testing what doors it could open, but had not yet reached the stage of actually extracting large amounts of data. They were still in the reconnaissance phase, the same quiet, patient phase we've talked about before, when the internal team happened to catch it. If that junior engineer hadn't been debugging something unrelated at that exact moment, if they'd noticed the strange pattern but decided it wasn't worth mentioning, if the message had landed in a channel nobody checked until the next morning, if the security team had been slower to take the report seriously, treating it as a low-priority curiosity instead of an urgent issue, any one of those small human variables shifting even slightly, and this becomes a very different story. Instead of the company that almost got breached through a third-party tool, it becomes another headline. Another data breach notification email landing in millions of inboxes. Another company issuing a statement about how seriously they take security, right after failing to actually demonstrate that in the moment it mattered most. I think that razor-thin margin between disaster and near miss is honestly the most important part of this entire story, and it's the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone running a business that depends on third-party tools, which, again, is basically every business at this point. Let's talk about what actually changed at this company afterward, because I think the response is just as instructive as the near miss itself. The first thing they did was something most companies genuinely never bother doing until something like this forces their hand, which was a full audit of every single third-party tool connected to their systems, mapping out exactly what access each one actually had, not what they assumed it had, not what made sense when it was originally set up 2 years earlier, but what it actually currently had access to, right now in reality. And the results, according to people who were part of that process, were genuinely uncomfortable. Several tools had far broader access than anyone remembered granting, either because permissions had crept upward over time as features got added, or because nobody had ever bothered narrowing access down after the initial, overly broad setup that's usually the path of least resistance when you're just trying to get something working quickly. The second thing they did was build a policy that a lot of companies talk about wanting to do, but rarely actually follow through on, which is treating every new third-party integration as a genuine security decision from day one, not an afterthought. Before any new tool gets connected now, someone has to explicitly document exactly what access it needs, why it needs that specific level of access, and what the actual blast radius would look like if that particular tool ever got compromised the same way the workflow automation tool did. The third thing, and I think this is honestly the hardest one for most companies to actually implement, was building a genuine culture around treating small, uncertain signals as worth investigating immediately, rather than something to be dismissed, unless it's already clearly, obviously a problem. That's a cultural shift, not a technical one, and cultural shifts are almost always harder to build and maintain than any specific piece of security software. I think there's a bigger lesson buried in this story that goes way beyond just this one company, and it's something I keep coming back to over and over again in basically every story like this. The relationship between a company and its own security has quietly stopped being just about that company's own walls. It's become a question about the security posture of an entire sprawling web of vendors, tools, and integrations that most companies have never fully mapped out, let alone actively monitored on an ongoing basis. Every single tool you connect to your business is, in a very real sense, an extension of your own security perimeter, whether you think of it that way or not. And the uncomfortable truth is that most companies have far less visibility into that extended perimeter than they have into their own core systems. You can spend enormous amounts of time and money hardening your own infrastructure, and still end up with a massive, unmonitored vulnerability sitting quietly in some vendor's environment that you've never once thought to ask hard questions about. I also think this story highlights something important about luck, and I want to be honest about that instead of pretending this was purely a story of skill and good process. A huge part of why this company avoided disaster came down to a genuinely lucky coincidence. An engineer happening to be looking at exactly the right logs at exactly the right time for a completely unrelated reason. That's not something you can fully engineer or guarantee. You can build a culture that makes it more likely someone notices and speaks up. You can build systems that make unusual activity more visible, but you can't eliminate the role that pure chance plays in whether a near miss stays a near miss or becomes the next headline. And I think that uncomfortable reality is exactly why this story matters so much, more than a lot of the actual successful breach stories we've talked about before. Because it's a reminder that the line between we caught it in time and we became the next cautionary tale is often thinner and more dependent on luck than most companies want to admit to themselves, or to their customers, or honestly, to their own leadership teams sitting in a boardroom feeling confident about their security posture. I keep thinking about how many other companies right now are sitting in the exact same position this company was in before that junior engineer happened to notice something odd. Connected to dozens of third-party tools, each one individually reasonable, each one solving a real problem at the time it was adopted, collectively adding up to an enormous, largely unmapped attack surface that nobody has fully audited in longer than anyone would probably feel comfortable admitting out loud. The honest, uncomfortable truth is that most companies are one compromised vendor away from experiencing some version of this exact story. The only real variable is whether they happen to have someone paying close enough attention, at exactly the right moment, to catch it before it turns into something far worse. And relying on that kind of luck, as this story genuinely demonstrates, isn't much of a strategy at all. If you're running any kind of business right now that depends on third-party SaaS tools, and again, that's essentially every business that exists in some form today, I think the real question worth asking yourself isn't whether you trust the tools you're using. Trust was never really the right question in the first place. The real question is whether you actually know what would happen, specifically, in detail, if any one of those tools got compromised tomorrow, the same way this workflow automation tool did. Do you know what data it can reach? Do you know what systems it's connected to? Do you have any way of noticing quickly if something about its access patterns suddenly looks wrong? If the honest answer to any of those questions is, I'm not really sure, you're not alone. Almost every company is in that exact same position right now. But this particular story is a pretty clear demonstration of exactly how close I'm not really sure can come to becoming a genuine catastrophe, saved, in this case, by nothing more reliable than one person happening to notice something slightly off, at exactly the right moment, and caring enough to say something about it instead of scrolling past. That margin is thinner than almost anyone running a business today wants to admit. And I think stories like this one, the ones that almost happened instead of the ones that did, deserve just as much attention as the headline-grabbing disasters, because they're the clearest possible warning of exactly how close that same disaster is sitting, quietly, right now, inside businesses that have no idea how thin their own margin actually is. If this made you think differently about the tools your own business quietly depends on every single day, subscribe, because we're going to keep telling these stories, the successes and the disasters both, because honestly, the line between them is a lot thinner than most people realize.